Northern frontier territory. A winter storm carved through the mountains with the kind of cold that made men question their right to survive. When rancher Gideon Crow found the woman collapsed near his fence line, blood darkening the snow beneath her, he thought she was dead. But when her eyes opened, black as creek water at midnight, something in his chest forgot how to work properly. What he didn't know was that saving her life would cost him something far more dangerous than blood. It would cost him the wall he'd built around what was left of his heart. The wind had been building since dawn, carrying the smell of snow and something else, something metallic that made the horses nervous in their shelter. Gideon had learned to trust what the animals knew. So when they refused to settle, he'd ridden out too, checked the fence lines one last time before the storm trapped him inside for days. That's when he saw the dark shape against the white, too still to be sleeping, too small to be a threat. His hand went to the rifle across his saddle, but stayed there, frozen when he got close enough to see her face. She was Apache. He knew it from the beadwork on what was left of her torn clothing, from the way her hair fell black and heavy across the snow. A gash ran along her temple, fresh enough that it hadn't stopped bleeding. Her lips had gone the color of a bruise. She should have been dead, would be dead soon if he left her there. The smart thing, the safe thing would be to ride back to his cabin and let the frontier take care of its own business. He'd survived 3 years alone by keeping clear of complications, especially the kind that came with tribe markings and blood feuds he didn't understand. But then her eyes opened. They fixed on him with such intensity that his breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. She didn't speak, didn't move, except for the barely visible rise and fall of her chest. Just watched him with those black eyes that seemed to see straight through to all the empty spaces inside him. His horse shifted beneath him, sensing something he couldn't name. The wind pulled at his coat, at her hair, at the moment stretching between them like a rope drawn too tight. She tried to sit up, and the sound that came from her throat, half pride, half pain, decided things for him in a way logic never could. He dismounted before he could think better of it, his boots crunching through snow that was already starting to fall harder. When he reached for her, she jerked back despite the obvious cost of the movement, her hand moving to where a knife should have been, but wasn't. Her eyes went wild for a second, trapped animal wild, and he stopped with his hands raised. Easy, he said, though. He didn't know if she understood English. Storm's coming. You'll be dead before morning out here. She stared at him, breathing hard through clenched teeth, and he could see her making some kind of calculation behind those eyes. Trust versus survival, pride versus necessity. Whatever she decided, it wasn't forgiveness. It was acceptance of the lesser danger. When she didn't fight him the second time he reached for her, it wasn't surrender, it was strategy. He lifted her onto his horse, and the way she held herself rigid against him told him everything about how much she hated needing his help. The ride back took twice as long as it should have. She stayed conscious, barely, her weight against him, slight, but somehow heavier than it should have been. He could feel her shivering start before they were halfway home, the kind of shaking that came from cold soaking in a bone. His cabin appeared through the thickening snow like a promise neither of them had asked for. When he carried her inside and laid her near the fire, she didn't thank him, just watched him with those unreadable eyes while he built up the flames, her hands still searching for the weapon she'd lost. He brought water, cloth, whiskey for the wound. She let him clean the gash on her temple, but her jaw stayed locked. No sound of pain escaping even when he knew it had to. Hurt. He could feel her studying him, measuring him against something he couldn't see. The silence between them filled the small cabin like smoke, thick, uncomfortable, charged with questions neither knew how to ask. Outside, the storm hit full force, and the sound of wind against the walls made it clear that whatever was going to happen between them would happen here in this small space with nowhere to run. When he stepped back, she spoke for the first time. Her voice came low and rough, scratched by cold and something deeper. Why? Just that one word, but it carried enough weight to fill the room. Why save her? Why risk it? Why bring her here when her people and his barely existed in the same world without bloodshed? He didn't have an answer that made sense, not one he could say out loud. So he just handed her the blanket and turned back to the fire, tried to ignore the way his hands had started shaking for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. But he could feel her eyes on his back, burning hotter than the flames. And something told him that the storm outside was going to be the easy part. The real danger was already inside, wrapped in a blanket by his fire, watching him like she could see every scar he carried beneath his skin. The fire crackled between them like a third presence, neither comfort nor threat, just heat that made the small cabin feel smaller. Gideon kept his back to her while he prepared food, but he could feel the weight of her stare pressing against his shoulders. Every movement he made seemed louder than it should. The scrape of the pot against iron, the splash of water, the careful way he set the bowl down within her reach without getting close enough to make her flinch again. She didn't touch the food, just watched him through the steam rising from the bowl, her dark eyes tracking every gesture like she was reading a language written in his posture. The silence stretched until it felt physical, something he could almost reach out and touch. He'd grown comfortable with quiet over the 3 years since he'd buried his wife and daughter. But this was different. This silence had teeth. "You speak English?" he said finally. Not a question. She'd understood him earlier. He was certain of that. She let a full minute pass before answering, her voice still carrying that rough edge. "So you got a name?" Another long pause. The wind hammered at the walls, and somewhere outside, something metal rattled loose and began its rhythmic banging. She tilted her head slightly, considering him, and he had the uncomfortable sensation of being measured against standards he couldn't begin to guess at. "Kiona." The word came wrapped in reluctance, like she was handing him something she didn't want to hold. He nodded once, trying to ignore the way his pulse had picked up at the sound of her voice saying her own name. "Gideon." When she didn't respond, he added, "You're bleeding through the cloth." She glanced down at the bandage on her temple, then back at him with an expression that suggested she'd noticed hours ago and didn't particularly care. The message was clear. She'd survived, worse without his help, and the wound wasn't worth discussing. But the blood seeping through the white fabric told a different story, one about pride costing more than it was worth. He moved slowly, telegraphing every motion, and gathered fresh cloth in the whiskey bottle. This time when he approached, she didn't pull back, but her whole body went rigid, coiled like a spring. He knelt beside her, close enough now to see the fine tremor in her hands that she was trying to hide, close enough to catch the scent of pine smoke and leather and something else he couldn't name. His fingers worked carefully, peeling away the soaked bandage, and he felt rather than heard her breath catch. "Why were you out there?" The question slipped out. Before he could stop it, her jaw tightened. "Why do you live alone?" "Fair enough." He poured whiskey over the fresh cloth and pressed it to the wound. She didn't make a sound, but her hand shot out and gripped his wrist hard enough that he felt her nails through his sleeve. For a heartbeat, they stayed frozen like that. Her hand locked around his wrist, both of them barely breathing. Then she released him and looked away, but not before he saw something flicker across her face, something that looked almost like fear, though not of him. 3 years ago, he said, quietly, wrapping the clean bandage. "Fever took my wife and girl. I came out here because everywhere else had too. Many ghosts." He didn't know why he told her. Maybe because she'd asked a real question instead of offering empty sympathy. Maybe because in this storm-locked cabin with death still fresh on both their minds, the truth felt like the only currency worth trading. She turned back to look at him, and for the first time since he'd found her in the snow, her expression shifted into something he could almost read. Recognition of shared weight. My people, she said slowly, each word costing her something, did not agree with my choice, so I made my own path. She paused, and her eyes went distant. Some paths lead to frozen ground and strangers with gentle hands. The way she said gentle made it sound like an accusation and a question at the same time. He finished, tying the bandage, and sat back, putting space between them again. But the air in the cabin had changed. Something had been exchanged in those words. Some acknowledgement that they were both running from ghosts that wouldn't stay. Buried. Outside, the storm's howl rose to a shriek, and inside the fire burned. Lower, he added wood. She ate the food without comment, and neither spoke again. For a long time. But when he finally stretched out on the floor near the door, giving her the only bed, he felt her eyes on him in the darkness, watching, wondering, deciding something he couldn't guess at. And the question that had been building since he'd first seen those black eyes open in the snow pressed harder against his ribs. What had he really brought into his carefully constructed solitude? The storm would pass eventually, but whatever was happening between them in this small space filled with firelight and unspoken truths felt like it might be the kind of weather that never fully cleared. He woke to the sound of her moving in the darkness. Not the careful movements of someone trying to be quiet, but the harsh, uneven breathing of someone fighting something invisible. The fire had burned down to coals, casting barely enough light to see her silhouette on the bed, her body drawn tight, one hand pressed against her ribs. The wound on her head wasn't the only injury she'd been hiding. Gideon sat up slowly, giving her time to hear him move, to know he was awake. She went, still immediately, but he could see the tension radiating through her frame. "You're hurt," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "More than just your head. I'm Euphine." The words came through clenched teeth, undermined by the way she held herself. "You're a terrible liar." He stood and moved to build up the fire, giving her a moment to decide whether pride or pain was going to win this particular battle. The flames caught and grew, throwing enough light to see her face properly. Sweat beat on her forehead despite the cold that had seeped into every corner of the cabin. Her left hand hadn't moved from her ribs, and the way she breathed, shallow and careful, told him everything. She wasn't saying, "Let me look." No, you could have broken ribs. Could be. Bleeding inside. Could be. I said no. But her voice cracked on the word, and they both heard it. He crossed the small space between them. Not fast enough to startle, but deliberate enough that she knew he was coming. When he knelt beside the bed, they were eye to eye, close enough that he could see the pain she was working so hard to mask. "I've already seen you nearly dead in the snow," he said quietly. "Your pride isn't going to be any more damaged by letting me check if you're dying slower." Something flickered in her eyes. Anger maybe, or respect for the directness. She held his gaze for a long moment, some internal war playing out behind those dark eyes, and then she, slowly, reluctantly lifted the borrowed shirt enough to expose her left side. The bruising spread across her ribs like spilled ink, deep purple bleeding into black. He'd seen injuries like that before. She'd taken a serious fall or a hard blow, and every breath she took had to feel like fire. His fingers moved carefully along the edge of the bruising, checking for displacement, for the telltale give of broken bone. She went rigid under his touch, every muscle locked, but she didn't pull away. He could feel her heartbeat accelerating beneath his palm, could feel the heat of her skin, even through the pain she was drowning in. The clinical necessity of the examination couldn't quite mask the awareness that crept in. The way his hands looked against the brown of her skin, the way her breathing changed when his thumb found a particularly tender spot. The fact that she was letting him touch her at all when every instinct told him she trusted no one. Not broken, he said, finally sitting back but badly bruised. You need to wrap them. Keep them stable. He reached for the remaining cloth strips, but her hand caught his wrist again, the same grip as before, strong enough to hurt. Why are you doing this? Her voice came rougher than before, almost desperate. Why not just she trailed off? But he understood. The question, why not just let her leave? Let the frontier take her. Let someone else's story unfold without him. In it, he looked down at where her fingers pressed into his skin, then back to her face. Because 3 years ago, I couldn't save anyone, and maybe I can't save you either. But I'm not going to just let you bleed out in my bed without at least trying. She released his wrist slowly, something shifting in her expression that he couldn't quite read. Permission maybe, or surrender, or just exhaustion, finally winning over pride. He wrapped her ribs as carefully as he could, and she bore it in silence, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, he started to move away, but her voice stopped him. They were hunting me. The words came quiet but clear. Men, from a settlement 2 days north. I took something that belonged to me first, but they don't see it that way. They won't. Stop looking. The information settled in his chest like a stone. How many? 4, maybe 5 by now. He should have felt fear. Should have been calculating how to get her out and away before those men brought their trouble to his door. Instead, what he felt was a slow, burning anger at men who would chase an injured woman through a winter storm and a strange, fierce determination that they wouldn't find her here. Not while he had anything to say about it. The storm will cover your tracks, he said. By the time they can move again, the trail will be buried. She studied him like she was trying to solve an equation that didn't add up. You would lie for me, risk them, coming here? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he met her eyes and let her see whatever truth lived in his storm won't last forever, he said finally. We'll figure out the rest when it breaks. But even as he said it, standing in the warm glow of the firelight with her eyes locked on his aunt, the space between them charged with things neither could name, he wondered if the storm breaking was going to solve anything at all, or if it would just force them to face what they'd been building in this small cabin while the world outside tried to tear them apart. The second night brought a cold that felt personal, like the storm had decided to test exactly how much the human body could endure before giving up. The fire burned as high as Gideon dared push it, but the wind found every crack in the cabin walls, every weak point in the structure, and poured through with icy fingers. He'd given Kiona both blankets and taken his coat, but even wrapped in layers, she couldn't stop shaking. He tried not to watch her from his place on the floor. Tried to focus on the sound of wind and the crackling fire. But every tremor that ran through her body seemed to register. In his own chest, she was trying to hide it, curled on her side, facing the wall. But her shoulders shook in a rhythm that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with cold, reaching bone deep. The wrapped ribs weren't helping. They restricted her breathing, made it harder for her body to generate the heat it desperately needed. Kiona, his voice cut through the wind's howl. She didn't respond, either because she hadn't heard or because she was refusing to acknowledge what they both knew was happening. He sat up, watching the visible tremors increase. You're going to freeze. I'm Fine. The words came through chattering teeth, destroying any credibility they might have had. He stood and moved to the bed before he could overthink it. She tensed immediately when his weight settled on the edge, her whole body going rigid despite the shaking. This is going to sound like something it's not, he said quietly, but you need to get warm. And I'm the only source of heat in this cabin besides that fire, which clearly isn't enough. She turned her head just enough to look at him, and even in the dim firelight, he could see the conflict written across her face, pride wearing with survival, distrust fighting against the simple reality of flesh that had gone too cold for too long. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint that made his chest tighten with something uncomfortably close to fear. "I won't touch you," he said, though the words felt like a lie, even as he spoke them. "Beyond what's necessary, but you need to let me help before we're both regretting it for different reasons." The moment stretched between them, measured in the visible clouds of their breath and the violent shaking of her frame. Then she nodded once, barely perceptible, and shifted to make room. He lay down behind her, leaving a careful inch of space between them, and pulled the blankets over both their bodies. The cold, radiating from her, shocked him. She felt like stone pulled from winter water. Every part of her chilled through. "I need to get closer," he said against her hair. "Need to share heat properly." Her only answer was a small sound that might have been agreement or resignation. He closed the distance, pressing his chest against her back, his knees tucking up behind hers. She went absolutely still for a heartbeat, and he could feel the wild hammering of her heart through the layers between them. Then slowly, incrementally, she began to relax. Against him, not surrender. Exactly. More like a conscious decision to let survival override every other instinct. His arms settled across her waist, careful of her injured ribs, and the shaking that had consumed her began to ease. Gradually, degree by painful degree, her body temperature started to climb. But with the warming came awareness of a different kind. The way she fit against him like two pieces, carved from the same stone. The smell of her hair, smoke and pine, and something uniquely her. The way her breathing was starting to synchronize with his falling into the same rhythm without either of them choosing it. He felt her hand find his where it rested near her stomach, her fingers curling around his palm in a grip that could have meant gratitude or need or something. Neither of them had words for yet. The storm rattled the walls and the fire burned lower. And in the small, warm space they'd created between their bodies, something fundamental was shifting. Something that had started with finding her in the snow and grown with every moment of forced proximity, every shared truth, every touch that lasted a fraction longer than strictly necessary. Gideon, his name in. Her mouth sounded different than he'd ever heard it. Rough and soft at once. She didn't say anything else, but she didn't have to. The way she pressed back against him slightly, no longer holding herself separate, said everything that needed saying. They were crossing some invisible line. Both of them knew it, and neither was pulling back. He tightened his arm around her waist fractionally, an answer without words, and felt her breath catch. The cold was retreating, but neither of them moved apart. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, in the darkness and firelight, they lay tangled together and pretended it was only about survival. But the truth pressed between them as surely as their bodies did. This had stopped being about the cold somewhere along the way, and whatever it had become instead felt far more dangerous than any storm the frontier could throw at them. Morning brought no relief from the storm, only a gray half-light that barely penetrated the cabin's single window. They woke still tangled together, and for a long moment neither moved. Gideon felt the shift in her breathing that meant she was awake, felt the way her body had softened against his during the night. All the rigid barriers melted away in sleep. His hand still rested at her waist, and her fingers were still laced through his, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a world trying to tear loose. She turned in his arms, a slow, deliberate movement that brought them face to face on the narrow bed. The space between their faces measured in inches, close enough that he could count the individual lashes framing those dark eyes, close enough to feel the warmth of her breath against his mouth. Neither spoke. Words would have required acknowledging what was happening and acknowledging it would force decisions neither was ready to make. Her free hand came up to trace the line of his jaw, her calloused fingertips rough against his skin. The touch was feather-like, exploratory, like she was reading him through touch the way others might read words on a page. His pulse kicked hard, enough that he was certain she could feel it. Her thumb brushed across his lower lip, and the air between them went dense with possibility. I should get up, he said, not moving. Check on the horses. You should. Her voice came barely above a whisper, but she didn't pull away either. Her hand slid from his, face to rest against his chest, directly over his heart, which was currently trying to beat its way through his ribs. But you won't. She was right, and they both knew it. He couldn't have moved away from her in that moment. If the cabin had been burning down around them, something had shifted fundamentally during the long, cold night. Some barrier crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. The way she looked at him now held none of yesterday's weariness. Instead, her eyes carried a heat that had nothing to do with the fire dying in the hearth. What are we doing? The question escaped before he could stop it rough and honest. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Something foolish. Her hand pressed firmer against his chest. Something that will complicate everything. She moved, imperceptibly closer, the last bit of careful distance evaporating. Something I stopped trying to talk myself out of. About an hour before dawn, his hand tightened at her waist, his thumb finding the strip of exposed skin where her borrowed shirt had written up during the night. The contact made her breath hitch, made her eyes go heavy-lidded in, a way that shot straight through him. Those men looking for you will find me, or they won't. Will kill me, or they won't. Her voice held an edge of something fierce. But right now, in this moment, they don't exist. The storm doesn't exist. There's just this cabin, this bed, and she stopped, seeming to wrestle with words that wouldn't come. And us, he finished quietly. And us, she said it like a confession, like an admission of something dangerous. Her forehead came to rest against his there, noses almost touching, and he could feel the tremor that ran through her. Not cold this time, but something else. Entirely. I don't trust Easy Gideon. My whole life, trusting the wrong person meant dying. But you, she trailed off, her hand moving from his chest to cup, the side of his neck. You make me want to break my own rules. He understood the weight of what she was saying, knew it, matched the truth, sitting heavy in his own chest. 3 years he'd kept the world at arm's length, certain that letting anyone close again would mean more loss than he could survive. But this woman, with her warrior's eyes and her carefully guarded heart, was dismantling every defense he'd built, one shared breath at a time. I buried everyone I loved, he said, the words scraping out of some deep place. Swear I'd never let myself care about anyone again. Safer. That way. Can't lose what you don't have. And now, her thumb traced small circles against the pulse point at his throat. Now I'm lying here terrified, he admitted, because I'm starting to think that trying to keep you safe matters more than keeping myself safe ever did. Something flickered across her face. Vulnerability mixing with desire. Fear tangled up with want. She shifted closer still, eliminating the last whisper of space between their bodies. And the heat that flared between them had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with being alive. His hand spread across the small of her back, and her leg hooked over his hip, drawing them together in a way that made rational thoughts scatter like ash and wind. The storm howled outside, the world beyond the cabin walls hostile and unforgiving. But inside, pressed together in the gray morning light, they found something worth the risk, something that made foolish decisions feel like the only honest choice. And where fingers threaded into his hair and her lips parted slightly, they both knew they were done pretending this was anything other than what it was. Two people who'd given up on wanting anything learning to want again. The fire had burned down to embers again by late afternoon. And despite the closeness they'd shared through the morning, Kiona had pulled away to give him space to work. She sat wrapped in a blanket near the hearth while he checked provisions and reinforced the door against wind that seemed determined to tear the cabin apart. Board by board, the temperature inside had dropped steadily as the storm intensified, and every gust that hit the walls sent cold air knifing through gaps he couldn't seem to seal fast enough. He could feel her watching him move around the small space, could sense the weight of unspoken things hanging between them. What had happened in the bed that morning existed in some undefined territory neither knew how to name, too much to ignore, too fragile to examine closely. So they moved around each other with careful politeness that felt more dangerous than honesty. Both pretending. The air wasn't still charged with everything they'd almost said. Almost done. You should eat something, he said, setting dried meat and hardtack within her reach. His voice came out rougher than intended. So should you. She didn't touch the food, just kept watching him with those dark eyes that seemed to see through every wall. He tried to rebuild between them. He forced himself to sit, forced himself to eat, but the food tasted like ash the wind screamed around the cabin, and the cold seemed to press in from all sides. Relentless and patient, even with the fire rebuilt, even with every blanket in use, the chill found its way into bone and blood. He could see her starting to shake again despite the layers wrapped around her. Could see the way her jaw locked with determination not to show weakness. It's getting colder, he said unnecessarily. Yes, that single word carried layers of meaning. Yes, it was getting colder. Yes, they both knew what that meant. Yes, they were going to have to face what they'd been dancing around all day. She pulled the blanket tighter, but her hands trembled where they gripped the fabric. The firelight played across her face, highlighting the bruise at her temple, the set of her mouth that was equal parts stubborn and vulnerable. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. He stood to add more wood to the fire, but they both knew it wouldn't be enough. The storm had stolen all the heat from the world, and the cabin was losing the battle against the cold seeping through every crack and crevice. When he turned back, she was looking at him with an expression that made his chest feel too tight. Gideon. His name on her lips carried a question she wasn't quite asking. He crossed the space between them slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to pull back, to rebuild the walls they'd been dismantling piece by careful piece. But she didn't move, just watch him approach with eyes that held something he was afraid to name. When he sat beside her near the fire, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, the tension between them felt like a physical presence. She was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames, her breath visible in the cold air. Then, so softly he almost missed it beneath the wind's howl, she spoke. It's cold. The pause that followed those two words held the weight of everything unspoken between them. Her eyes found as vulnerable and brave at once, and the rest came barely above a whisper. You can hold me if you want. Time stopped. His breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat, trapped by the simple enormity of what she just offered. Not demanded, not taken for granted, but offered with trust that he knew cost her everything. With vulnerability she'd spent a lifetime learning to hide. The invitation hung in the air between them, fragile as frost, heavy as stone. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at her while his heart tried to hammer its way out his chest. Those dark eyes held his without wavering, showing him the fear and the wanting tangled together, showing him that she was as terrified of this as he was, showing him that she was choosing it anyway. His hand moved first, reaching for hers where it gripped the blanket. There, fingers tangled together, and the contact sent electricity through his entire body. Kiona, he managed her name, rough in his throat. Not a question, not quite an answer, just her name carrying all the things he didn't have words for. She shifted closer, eliminating the careful distance they had maintained, and leaned into him. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest, and felt her settle against him, with a small sound that could have been relief or surrender. The blanket fell around both of them, cocooning them in, shared warmth, and he buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her while his pulse slowly remembered how to function. "I want," he said against her temple, the words escaping before he could stop them. Not a complete sentence, not a coherent thought, just the truth stripped bare. Want that he'd tried to bury with his family. Want that he'd convinced himself he'd never feel again. Want that this woman had somehow dragged back into light despite every defense he'd built. Her arms came around his waist, holding him as tightly as he held her. And in that moment, with the storm raging outside and the cold pressing in and the world narrowed too, this small space and this impossible connection, he understood that what he'd been calling survival had actually been surrender. Surrender to loneliness, to safety, to the slow death of never risking anything. And what she just offered him was the opposite. A chance to live dangerously, to want desperately, to risk the kind of loss that could destroy him. Her whispered words had been an invitation to stop merely surviving and start living again. Consequences be damned. They stayed wrapped together as night fell, neither willing to break the spell that had been cast with those whispered words. The fire burned steady. The wind continued its assault on the cabin walls, but inside their small cocoon of shared warmth, the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Her head rested against his chest, and his chin rested atop her hair, and neither spoke for a long time. Some things didn't need words. But eventually, in the darkness, lit only by firelight, she began to talk. Her voice came quiet and steady, like she was finally letting out something she'd carried alone for too long. "The thing I took," she said, and he felt her tension return slightly. "It was a necklace. My mother's. She wore it every day until she died. And then my father gave it to the man he wanted me to marry as payment for taking me off his hands." Gideon's arms tightened around her fractionally, but he didn't interrupt. She needed to tell this her own way in her own time. "I refused the marriage. Said I would choose my own path or walk it alone. My father said I dishonored him, dishonored our family. The man he'd chosen came anyway. Took the necklace with him like it was already his." Her fingers traced patterns against Gideon's chest, restless and unconscious. "So I followed. Him took it back. He and his friends came after me, and I ran. Ran until the storm caught me, and then I couldn't run anymore. Your mother's necklace," he said, quietly. "That's worth dying for." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, and the firelight caught the fierce pride in her eyes. "It's the only piece of her I have left. The only proof she existed, that she loved me, that I came from someone who was more than what they try to make me." Her hand came up to touch his face, her thumb brushing along his cheekbone. "You understand that? You said you came here because everywhere else had too many ghosts. But you brought them with you anyway. I can see them in your eyes sometimes." He did understand. Understood it in a way that went deeper than words. "My daughter," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "Sarah, she was 5, had her mother's laugh and my stubborn streak." He paused, wrestling with memories that still had teeth. "When the fever came, I tried everything. Rode 2 days to get a doctor, but by the time we got back, he stopped, unable to finish." Kiona's hand slid to the back of his neck, her fingers gentle against his skin. "You couldn't save them." "No." The word came, outbroken. "And I've spent 3 years wondering if I'd been faster, smarter, done something different." He stopped, shaking his head. "They're gone and I'm here. And some days I don't know if that's fair or if it's punishment." "It's neither," she said firmly. "It's just what is. You survived, Gideon. That's not a crime. She shifted in his arms, turning, to face him more fully. My mother used to say that we're not measured by what we lost, but by what we do with what remains. You could have let the grief make you cruel. Instead, you pulled a wounded stranger from the snow and saved her life. Maybe I saved you because I couldn't save them, he admitted. Maybe that's selfish. Maybe, she agreed. Or maybe you saved me because you're a good man who was given a second chance to do something that matters. Her eyes held, his intense and unwavering. Either way, I'm alive because of you. And tonight, in this cabin with this storm trying to kill us both, I'm choosing to be grateful for that. Choosing to stop, running long enough to feel something besides fear and anger. He puffed her face in his palm, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. What are you feeling? She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly, say for the first time, and longer than I can remember. When her eyes opened again, they held a heat that made his pulse stutter and alive. Dangerously, recklessly alive. The kiss happened without conscious decision. Just a closing of the distance that had been shrinking between them since the moment her eyes had opened in the snow. Her lips were soft and warm against his. And when she made a small sound in the back of her throat, something in his chest cracked wide open. The kiss deepened, turning from tentative exploration into something hungrier, more desperate. His hands tangled in her hair, and hers gripped his shirt like she was afraid he might disappear. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. The storm won't last forever, he said. Eventually, you'll have to decide. Stay here with me or keep running. I know. Her voice came, rough, scraped raw by everything they'd shared. But tonight, right now, in this moment, I'm here and that's enough. It should have felt insufficient. This, borrowed time stolen from the edges of a storm, but wrapped in each other's arms with a fire burning low in there. Hearts beating in rhythm. It felt like everything, like a promise neither could fully make, but both desperately wanted to keep. The ghost they carried might never fully disappear, but tonight together they were learning that even haunted people deserved moments of peace. Even broken people deserve to feel whole. And sometimes the most courageous thing you could do was let yourself want something worth losing. Dawn broke clear and cold. The storm, finally exhausted. Gideon woke to pale sunlight streaming through the window, and Kiona still in his arms, her breathing deep and even against his chest. For a moment, he let himself imagine this was permanent. Waking up to her warmth, her presence, the sense that the cabin wasn't empty anymore. Then reality crept back in with the sound of horses approaching through snow. Kiona tensed immediately, fully awake in an instant. They found me. He moved to the window, careful to stay out of sight. 4 men on horseback, picking their way through the drifts, heading straight for his cabin. Their leader sat tall in the saddle, a hard-faced man with a rifle across his lap. Gideon recognized the type. Men who believed ownership extended to people who wouldn't stop until they got what they came for. Stay inside, he said quietly, reaching for his own rifle. Let me handle this. Gideon, trust me. He looked back at her, and something passed between them that needed no words. She nodded once, her hand finding the knife he'd returned to her that morning. Not surrender, but partnership. If this went wrong, they'd face it together. He stepped outside before the men could dismount, his rifle held low, but ready. That's far enough. His voice carried clear across the snow. State your business. The leader reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the cabin, looking for her. We're tracking a thief. Apache woman took something valuable from my camp. Tracks led here before the storm hit. He smiled, but it held no warmth. You harboring criminals, friend? I'm harboring no one. Gideon kept his voice level calm. And I'm not your friend. This is my land. You're not welcome on it. We just want what's ours. The man's hand moved closer to his rifle. Hand her over and we'll be gone. There's no one here but me. Gideon raised his own rifle slightly, just enough to make his position clear. And even if there was, I don't hand over people to men who hunt women through winter storms. Whatever she took, it's not worth her life. The tension stretched thin as wire. The four men exchanged glances, calculating odds, weighing their desire for revenge against the reality of a man who clearly wouldn't back down. Gideon kept his breathing steady, kept his finger near the trigger, and waited. He'd buried everyone he loved once. He wouldn't let these men take the person he was learning to love now. Finally, the leader spat into the snow. Keep her, then, but tell her Mason Ward doesn't forget. She shows her face in any settlement from here to the northern territories. We'll be waiting. I'll pass along your regards. Gideon didn't lower the rifle until they'd turned their horses and started back the way they'd come. Only when they disappeared over the ridge did he let himself breathe fully again. Kiona emerged from the cabin, her knife still in hand, her eyes tracking the retreating figures. You made an enemy for me. No. He turned to face her. I made a choice for myself. For us. He paused, suddenly aware of the weight of that word. Us, if that's what you want. She crossed the space between them, moving through the snow with that same fluid grace he'd first seen when her eyes opened in the storm. When she reached him, she took his face in both hands and kissed him, hard enough to steal breath, to make promises without words. When she pulled back, her eyes held determination mixed with something that looked like hope. The necklace is in my pack, she said. My mother's memory is safe, and I'm done running. Her thumb traced his cheekbone, the gesture already familiar. I spent so long surviving alone that I forgot what it felt like to live with someone, to want to stay somewhere, to want to build something instead of just protecting what's left. Stay, he said simply. Not a question, not quite a plea, just an invitation to the life they could make together. Yes, the word came sure and clear. No hosetashchen. But not because I'm hiding or because I have nowhere else to go. She smiled, then real and bright. I'm staying because when you found me in that snow, I was dying. And you didn't just save my life. You reminded me what living could be. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, feeling her arms wrapped tight around him. The sun climbed higher, melting snow from the cabin roof. And somewhere in the distance, a bird called out the promise of spring. Two people who'd been broken by loss had found each other in storm, and in finding each other, had discovered that even shattered pieces could be rebuilt into something whole. The ghost would always be there. His wife and daughter, her mother, and the life she'd left behind. But they'd carry them together now, and somehow that made the weight bearable. In the clear morning light, with the storm behind them, an uncertain future ahead, they'd chosen each other. And that choice made freely in the aftermath of survival felt like the bravest thing either had ever done. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier where courage and connection change everything. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you stories like these. Your support means the world to us.